Welcome to the Sons of Mjolnir podcast.
The Sons of... what?
This isn't your Sons of Macaroni, yeah!
The Sons of Mjolnir?
This is Sons of Mjolnir, yeah!
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Sons of Mjolnir. As always, I am one of your hosts, Fat Thor.
I'm Gorgon.
I'm Cap.
And today we are joined by a very, very special guest. You know him, you love him. If you don't know him yet, you're gonna love him. Mr. Jackson Lanzing, one half of the Hivemind. Jackson, thank you so much for being here with us. We are huge fans of your guys' work. For people that listen and watch us, you guys have probably listened to our Cold War episode that we did. I think that for our New Year's episode, I think all three of us picked Kang as our favorite book of the year. So we have been huge fans of you guys for a while, and we could not be more excited for you to come and nerd out with us.
Wow, I'm honored. Thanks, guys. Kang was one of those books, man. It just changed it changed our whole life. Like it was such an opportunity, and it wasn't one of those weird things that like came our way. Like we chased it, and Marvel and Alana, especially at Marvel, really going to bat for it. Tom Brevoort really going to bat for it, and like letting us do something that like personal and that specific with Kang, this character who had a lot riding on him. I feel very honored that we got to tell that story, and the fact that it resonated for anybody means a lot to me. So really dug it.
You said that you changed your guys' life. I mean, I would say it changed a lot of people's lives because we really all resonated really hard with that book. And I mean, we're going to get into Kang. Don't worry. We for sure will get into the nuts and bolts of Kang. But before we get to that, I kind of want to go back a little bit and kind of go through the comic origin of Jackson Lanzing. So I know that you kind of had a rather unique experience as opposed to some other comic book fans growing up. I saw you were talking about how your mom actually had a rule that you couldn't read or watch anything with people hurting other people. So really your comic kind of awakening didn't happen until you were a teenager. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Totally. So it was kind of it was two-pronged, right? So on the one hand, my mom had that rule, and on the other hand, my parents were divorced. And so my birth dad, he had this kind of his like process for, because he wasn't around a lot, his process for like getting into my life was when he was around, he'd be like, let's go buy comics, because he knew that was like a thing that my mom wouldn't do. So he was like, oh, you can do that, which I'm sure pissed her off, but quite a lot. But was it was sort of a straightforward way of like getting me into that stuff. And so when I was a kid, I would read Spider-Man and I would read Superman, which generally got away from my mom's problems just because they were like optimistic characters, and they were like generally about like bigger kind of, and frankly, a lot of Spider-Man's villains look like animals. A lot of Superman's villains look like big, crazy aliens. So it was a lot easier, I think, to like cross that line. So Spider-Man and Superman were both things that were really like in my life from that. My dad was reading Spawn. And so I'd be like, oh, like there's Spawn and I can't read Spawn, but I can read, I can read Superman and Spider-Man. And then in my mom's house, which was where I mostly was, she and my adopted father, Don, they had a collection of Vertigo books, like early Vertigo. So Books of Magic, Sandman, Hellblazer.
Okay.
A lot of that was in our house, and it was like in a bookshelf that generally the idea was like I wasn't supposed to read, but if I read it, then like they'd be impressed that I read it, right? So like eventually I started like cracking like Seasons of Mists off the thing, or looking at Books of Magic or whatever, and I would like start to get into that. And that was sort of my dual like comic book awakening. I had like the superhero awakening with like Superman, which was right in the middle of like, I'm going to date myself, but like it was like right in the middle of Death of Superman. It was like that, and which was sort of simultaneous to Clone Saga. And so I was sort of getting disillusioned with superhero comic books and the way that they would just like upend everything and then put everything back in the box. Like I remember thinking that they were permanently replacing Peter Parker with Ben Reilly, and like and being like, oh, that's kind of cool. Like I hate that. Love it. And then they, 2 years later, they were like, never mind. And I was like, oh God, superhero comics are this weird cyclical thing, as opposed to the Vertigo books, which really felt like oh, we're taking you on a story, and when the story is done.
Yeah, and that's when you kind of learn like no one ever stays gone in comic books.
Exactly, but it kind of felt like people stayed gone in Vertigo.
Yeah.
You know, like not to spoil Sandman, but when Sandman ends, you sort of feel like, cool, like we have a dream, but it's not Morpheus. And the fact that they've taken you down that line felt like, you know, and then every time that they used Morpheus after that for a long time, if he showed up ever, it was always Daniel. And it really felt like, oh, that felt like a little bit of history. Comics felt like history that I could like access and then become kind of a historian in. And I'm a nerd who particularly loves history and research, and I love libraries. Colin's the same way. Like his comics origin story is a lot of him like getting comics from the library.
Yeah.
Because he was like remote. He was in Hawaii. So I've been I think I got very lucky because like I had these dual platforms, and then I stopped and I didn't touch comics for like 10 years. I got super into movies, and I got super into lit, and I got super into television. I got really into photography and art, and I got into like a lot of other stuff. And I really like left comic books for most of my teenage years, and thought like, I want to be a filmmaker. That's what I want to be. I want to be a movie director. That's my whole thing. I'm writing movies. I'm doing little short films. That's all I want to do in high school, right? Is I want to be a film director. I want to work in theater. I want to do all that. I was an actor. I did a whole bunch of nonsense. And then X-Men 2 came out, and
from Whedon?
No, from Singer, like the movie.
The movie.
Like X2 X-Men.
Okay, dude, I love that. I have a personal love for that. And
dude, I loved X2 X-Men United. That movie rocks. And I was like, and I got through it, and I was like, shit, that movie was really good. And I had that Phoenix tease at the end, and I thought to myself, like, I don't really know what that means. I've never read X-Men. I specifically wasn't allowed to read or watch X-Men because X-Men was specifically people who look like people, mostly shooting each other with lasers.
Yeah,
very specifically not what I was allowed to watch. So I was like, shit, that looks really cool. I want to know more about that. I think I was like a sophomore. I remember my buddy Jared Keller, he was like the drummer in my band, like walked past me in the thing, and he was like, Phoenix, and I was like, I don't know what that means. He knows what that means, but I do, and that's what he means. So I was like, I should go figure that out. So I went down to in Boston. We had these two stores next to each other: Million Year Picnic, which was kind of the indie shop, and New England Comics, which was the more like traditional shop that has a lot of them around New England. And I went there and I said, hey guys, I went to New England Comics, and I said, hey, if I want to read X-Men, where do I start? And they said, well, you're in luck. The Chris Claremont run just started. So there's a Chris Claremont X-Men book right there. And then if you want like the old school, and then if you want the new school, Whedon and Cassidy are doing Astonishing X-Men right there. And that issue 1 just came out. So if you want that, you can grab that. And so I grabbed both of those, and I grabbed the first trade of Morrison's run and of New X-Men. And I read them all very rapidly. And then I quickly read the entirety of Grant's run, and then started going back and reading more and more and more, and became pretty obsessed with X-Men. And X-Men became my my in on comics. I sort of discovered how you could tell these serialized stories, and how it was okay that they were cyclical. Like it was okay that Magneto died and came back and died and came back and died and came back. It was okay that Jean stayed dead. Like that stuff actually fed the story and made it what it was. And I was like, shit, okay, I think I love this. And then the more that I got into that, the more it became a question of like, okay, well then what's the next thing? And so pretty quickly then it was like, then I'm getting into Batman, and I'm finding all of the Miller and Loeb and Sale Batman stuff. And I'm reading Batman for the first time in my life when I'm like 15, discovering that whole ecosystem. And so what I would do is I would work. I had a job at Starbucks because I had no money. I come from a really poor family. So I had a job as a barista, and I would do that. I would get my paycheck. I would convert that paycheck into comic books, and then rinse and repeat. And that was that was my life for a few years there, until I went to college, and I didn't know anybody who read comics. I had a couple of friends who I was sort of getting into it, but I didn't know anybody else who had that sort of obsession with it until I went to college. And within 6 months, I met Colin Kelly, who has become, obviously like the other half of me, of my business, of my life. He's my best friend, business partner, he's my co-writer. And we met through our friend David Server, because we would all have to get into a car and drive to the comic shop together. And so that became this really great way for us to be like, okay, so what are you reading? And then I would start reading that. And then, oh, what are you reading? And I start reading that. I get back into Spider-Man through Ultimate Spider-Man. We all got into Runaways and Young Avengers at the same time, because we were like exactly the right age to really get into all of that. So suddenly, like, I remember I went into their apartment and they had like a Runaways poster. I was like, what is that? And then and suddenly, and I was just like diving in. They showed me Batman Beyond for the first time. They showed me in the animated series and Batman the animated series. Like I got all of that education in college. Like, I didn't get that stuff as a kid. So my nostalgia, I really only have like one nostalgia or like two nostalgia buttons, which are Star Trek, because Star Trek, I watched all of it when I was a kid, and I'm just like deeply invested in it, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Like those are my two that I could like watch all the time and were like really reinforced in my life. Otherwise, I don't have, I guess in Star Wars, I guess. Other than that, I really don't have a lot of like that inherent nostalgia. Instead, what I have is just like a rapid fascination with it. I'm just constantly getting into it. I love to take a new dive. Every time we get a new book, I'm like, I get every printed, like, I'm like, when we did Cap, I'd read some Captain America. I had not read all of Captain America, but all of a sudden it was like inherent on me to know as much as I could about it. And so I read everything, right? And I love that. That's my favorite part of this job, is being able to like, oh, new gig, new character. Now I have to know everything about them. Go. And I get like 2 to 3 weeks to just learn.
And that's so, that was just going to say, that's so awesome to hear, because we've talked about this before on some of our previous episodes and even before we were getting on here. And one thing that we all really love about your guys' work, and I think that you guys do so well, is you can tell you've done your homework. And not only have you done your homework, but you do it in a way, like with Cap, just for an example, like you bring things back from Cap's history, but it's never like rehashing things. It's only to bring new things to the story and like new players to the table. And like I said, I think that's one of the reasons we all really enjoy your work is, again, you've done the homework and it shows in your writing. And that was kind of one of the questions we wanted to ask, is like you just said, so you get Captain America or you get Kang. So like, what does that research process look like?
The cool thing about the Hivemind is that Colin and I are, as much as we're the same writer in a lot of ways, we're really not the same person. Like we're really different guys. And so the way that we approach the work is different. And I think that helps. So like for me, yeah, it's research. I read everything. And so does Colin, but he doesn't do it. He'll pick the stuff that it seems interesting to him, and he'll kind of dive into that, knowing that I'm going to dive into all of it, so that as we build out, I can be the guy that's like, or in this issue,
well, actually,
yeah. But what's the problem with that process when it's on its own is it can become really cyclical. It can become really inaccessible. And a big part of what Colin and I are sort of obsessed with our work is making sure that somebody who's never read a Captain America book or a Guardians of the Galaxy book or a Thunderbolts book or whatever it is we're doing at that time, that they can jump in fresh, and that they really can get something out of it that's just contained to the story. That you don't need to know who Destroyer is or have read any Destroyer comics, right? You don't need to have read like all Winter Squad to get what we're doing with Destroyer in Sentinel of Liberty, right? So what's cool is I'll come in and I'll be like, I think the way, like, Destroyer is a good example, right? Because like we came in and we were talking about what we wanted our book to look like, and we're just talking about past, and everything we do with Colin and me comes from conversation. So I've done a bunch of research, and Colin's done a bunch of like free association. He's like thought up a bunch of weird places where he would love to play. He's very imaginative, and that's part of why it works, is like his imagination is huge, and then I can kind of come in and like try to put that imagination in a box a little bit, which isn't exactly the process, but it's like it's part of the process. So we'd be sitting there and being like, what does it mean to like use this character or this character? How does this go? And I remember at some point we were like, it'd be really good. One of the things we really want to do is have characters who feel like they're of Cap's contemporaries. And we were putting together the radio company, and we sort of had like John and Pam, and we're like, cool, there should be someone here who's like still a hero. And I had recently I'd read some All Winners, but then I'd also gone back and like V Battalion. But then I also read Kirkman's Marvel Max mini on Destroyer. I read that when it was coming out. Kirkman did this like very violent kind of almost nihilistic take on Destroyer that was about him as like an old man learning that he has cancer, and he's just like, I'm just gonna kill all my old foes before I die, and he like puts on the mask and just goes to like revenge kill at the end. And it was an interesting book. It like stuck around in my brain. I always liked the design. I liked that he kind of looked like a Skrull. I was like, this guy's weird. I don't know what to do with this. And so I was like, well, Destroyer's probably still around. There's probably some version. And when we looked it up and we discovered like, oh, Roger Aubrey's still playing, he's still around, he's still available, and no one's going to use him. He's at the end of his life. He's not a character anybody's going to be like grabbing at. We're like, well, great. This is an awesome chance both to use Roger Aubrey, but then to solve a big story problem for ourselves, which is Sharon Carter doesn't have anything to do. Like, not just in our story, just in general. Sharon Carter is like a character who struggles constantly to find a place for her own narrative. She's so just a part of Cap's narrative. And so we've been talking a lot about like, how do we give Sharon her own thing? And we felt it was odd that she'd never had a real moniker other than Agent 13, which certainly isn't one that was given, like, that she gave to herself, right? That was given to her. It was like, how can we activate her? And then we kept talking about what we like about her and how messy she was and all this stuff. And then I'm sitting there being like, well, there's this character Destroyer. And we're like, well, shit. Now we have a character who we really feel can handshake. And the idea of Sharon Carter as Destroyer suddenly embraces all the things we love about Sharon. She's messy, she's violent, she's a little trigger happy, she's a little intense, she's willing to do the shit that Steve's not willing to do. And then lets her take on a moniker that like attaches her to a different legacy, that one that's connected to Steve, but gets to sit, you know, part and parcel away from it. And that's how like something like Sharon Carter Destroyer comes up, is like Colin has this sort of like, I want to do something with Sharon, and I've got the, well, here's the history of the Destroyer, and like we're able to take those two things and marry them. So I think my part of it, in a large part, in early days, is research, and then Tetris. And Colin's part of it, in large part, is like free association and instinct. And then kind of marry those two things to create stories that both of us can get excited about. And that's sort of when we know that we've hit something, is when both sort of the conversation goes silent and both of us go like, yeah, that's cool. And we'll be like, yeah, that's cool. And we'll be like, great.
All right, it's in there.
Yeah, it's in the movie to use.
We were talking earlier today about like how much, you know, but before you got on, how much we can feel the way you guys do homework and what it does. And I like that you bring up Sharon Carter, because that was a twist that I remember watching Thor and Cap talk, and they were like, yo, and as someone who's a lore whore, does the research before you go, okay, cool, this could be a really cool deal, particularly with Sharon. Have you guys seen Falcon and the Winter Soldier? And if so, how did you feel about this Sharon twist of her being power broker, changing her from Agent 13 to something different for people experiencing her the first time in the MCU?
Yeah, so I would be hard pressed to look at the timeline and see which one of those came first. I would have to look back and like, because that shit gets muddy for me. But
what is time?
Yeah. What is time? But I think so. Falcon Winter Soldier, we could talk for hours about it. I have a lot of thoughts on Falcon Winter Soldier. It's based on a lot of my favorite comics. So for me, it's like, it's very easy to trip one way or the other. I thought specifically where that show really shined was in trying to give a real examination to Isaiah Bradley and to what the legacy of Captain America means through a specifically Black lens. I thought that was just so smart and so well done and so well written. There are sequences in that are all-timers for the Marvel Universe for me. The other place that I really like it is Sharon, specifically because what they're trying to do there is show who this person is outside of Steve's orbit. And it's the first time I've ever seen a Sharon who I feel like probably does drink a little too much, probably does have a little bit too much fun in fights, like probably is a little bit of a like belligerent person. That's part of what I like about Sharon, is she's not a straight up hero. She's a kind of haunted CIA agent who happens to be in love with Steve Rogers. The power broker thing, I still have to see how they're going to sell that down the line.
Right. That's exactly what we said.
Because it felt like such a villain twist that I was sort of assuming that they were going to make that a Skrull thing in Secret Invasion. And the fact that they didn't was just sort of like, okay, I don't really know what you're doing with this anymore. I'm curious to see. We'll see what they. I imagine that's a Captain America thing. We'll see what they play with it. Movies, they don't tell us anything, so we see it as it comes. The only time I've ever known something was happening on the MCU before it happened was Kang, and that was only because it was a guess, because they scheduled Kang #1 to come out the same day as the Loki finale, like very specifically. And I was like, all right.
Yeah.
All right. So I was on a plane, and my wife and I like pulled up
Like,
Loki
I see
finale. Yeah. We like pulled up the Loki finale on our phones and like watched it on a plane just to be like, oh my God, is it gonna be Kang? And there was
well, that's a perfect segue, honestly. So like I said, we're gonna get into Kang in just a second here, but I do want to ask, we're talking about this MCU stuff, and obviously with the strikes and stuff like that, we're going to try to avoid like very specific things, but we did want to ask you, so Kang the Conqueror, you have Guardians out, and we were just talking about the kind of parallels with Sharon Carter and the Falcon Winter Soldier. So being especially a Marvel writer in the age of the MCU, and not only that, but you just said yourself, you know, growing up, you were a very big film nerd. You and Colin were both film students at USC. So I'm curious, being someone intimately involved in the Marvel universe and being on the comic book side, what are your thoughts, not only on like the MCU as a whole, but especially what are your thoughts? And I feel like a big topic of conversation these days is how the MCU is influencing the comics and how vice versa that is also happening. And I feel like people fall on very extreme sides of that conversation. So I wanted to get like you, someone who actually does write this shit. So I would love your perspective on the whole MCU thing, and I guess the MCU'ifying of the comic books. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I kind of feel like we're the supervillains of that conversation because we are. Colin and I talk about this internally a little bit because we're aware, you know, and we want to. My shirt says that I'm simply not online. That's not true. It was. I wish it was, but
Same.
I'm working on it. X is making that easier for me. But so I do not think that it is realistic to imagine that the comics should be fully and fundamentally compartmentalized from the film and TV side. And I think the reason for that isn't just some cynical, well, it's business and everything's going to have to work together. No, you heard me earlier when I said I think it's really important that every comic be somebody's first comic. The MCU is well, it certainly should be. I don't know how much it is. I hope it is. But it should be a generator for new readers, right? It should be a way to get new readers into the comic book store and do their thing. And since I'm not Marvel exclusive and we are on strike right now in general, I can say DC Studios is doing this awesome right now. They like the minute Blue Beetle came out, they had the director of Blue Beetle out there being like, here's the 4 comics that inspired my movie. Here's a social, here's a whole thing. You have every other week, James Gunn sending something up the bestseller list at Amazon. I love this. I wish everyone was doing this. I think it's really important. I wish the Star Trek people were tweeting about the comics all the time. It costs them nothing, and it clearly generates readership. Like James is doing this at DC. I love it. It's really cool to like be so psyched about your boss. Badass, man. Similarly, like what's happening at Marvel, I think they've done this a little bit, but they could do a lot more. So I hope they continue to do more. I hope they continue to push it over. Now that said, as we get into the comic book side, when we're brought onto a thing that's movie aligned, and that's the terminology we use internally, like this is more movie aligned or more MCU aligned. All that is to say is like, you do want to have something that when somebody watches this movie and then they come into a comic book shop, they can see something that reminds them of the thing that they liked. So when it comes to Guardians of the Galaxy, right, we launched like essentially day and date there, or Kang, we launched essentially day and date there. You've seen this character, he's got gold and he's got a green and purple. Here's the green and purple. That's all you really need to know, and then you're in, right? It's fine. Like Kang didn't need to be very movie aligned. That wasn't really a concern because they were just tipping in on what they were doing with Kang. So then it's just like, okay, do your thing. And that was great. There was no movie alignment there at all. Guardians is inherently movie aligned. It sort of has to be, and that's not a matter of like us just coming in and being like, it has to be. It's like Marvel's going to expect that this team looks something like the team in the movies. It doesn't need to be exactly, and they're not going to enforce that. but they're going to ask for that because that's their job. They know that they want this to be something that somebody can come over on, right? That's just, I hope that doesn't sound cynical. That's just the way that it works. So when we come in on something like Guardians, the conversation is far less what's your team? We knew our team pretty early. I think the only person on our team who wasn't movie aligned initially, we had Marvel on the team because Marvel was a huge fandom point for both Colin and myself. Love that character. I've loved him since Marvel Boy. Grant Morrison's our biggest influence. Like I really, and Kieran Gillen's like one of my biggest influences. So like I really wanted to use Marvel. That was like a number one for us. And he was in the book until because we'd redeveloped Guardians like 3 times. I've been pretty public about this. Like we were really trying to find the right take because Marvel both wanted something that was movie aligned, but they also wanted something that looked and felt nothing like what had come before. Al's run is very specific and really awesome. I love Al Ewing. And it was important to Marvel that this feel like a fresh start because they had the people on the Al run. They did that run and they kept it going for as long as they could. They were like, all right, we want to do this new thing. It has to feel and look and be new. And so we looked at the team and we said, well, okay, Al expanded the team to this huge thing. So it's up to us to bring it back to something core. So we did that. And then we're like, honestly, we've got more to say about the characters that are quote unquote movie aligned, just because our fandom of the Guardians started with the Dan Abnett and Andy Lanning run, which is the movie team. So it's not like we're trying to be like, oh, we want to write the movie team. It's just it's that team. It's the team from those old comics that we really love that got us into Annihilation, right? So then we try to find a way to utilize the things that people will know from the comics or know from the movies enough to open the door, and then leave the movies over there. I don't want to know what they're doing. I don't know what their plot is. I don't want to know what their character arcs are. I don't want to know any of that junk. I don't want it to feel anything like the movies to read the comic. But I do want somebody who's watched the movies to be able to come over to the comic and be like, I know what a Star-Lord is. That's it, right? So we're doing this on Thunderbolts right now. Thunderbolts is very much a movie-aligned Thunderbolts, right? They just did a new version of Thunderbolts that Jim Zub and Sean Isaac did. It's a great book. It looks nothing like the movie team. It feels nothing like the movie team. So as they're figuring out what the movie version is going to be, they're like, all right, Colin Jackson, or we were coming off the cap. We were like, we want to keep going with Bucky. We had been trying to do a Bucky series basically. And they were like, well, Bucky's going to be leading up Thunderbolts. So why not do Thunderbolts? We said, okay, great. But like that team is kind of bonkers. I don't really have a lot of ins on a lot of those characters. I don't really know what to do with that necessarily. Can we make our own team? And they were like, yeah, just come in with a pitch, figure your thing out. And we sat down and looked at our pitch and we said, you know what we want to do with this, what Bucky requires in the aftermath of Sentinel of Liberty, ends in 3 days now, this is insane, is he's going to require a team of all of the best spy and espionage characters in the Marvel Universe. Okay, well, that means you're putting together a team with Black Widow on it. It means you're taking, so she's not movie aligned, but White Widow is. And I want White Widow and Black Widow on this team because Yelena's a cool character and only becomes cooler. So great, let's use both of them. If we have them, it'd be great to have Red Guardian because in the comics, Red Guardian is Natasha's ex-husband. So suddenly there's all this really weird internal mess with Bucky and her, and like, okay, that's great. And then we're like, well, okay, and then you probably want Sharon. We just did Destroyer, so we do Destroyer. She's not movie aligned, so that's fine. That gets to be in there. We'll bring in Val, but a different the Contessa, but like a different version of that character that's aligned to what we want to do. So it is movie aligned, but it's not. And then maybe let's look into our history here, and we figured out like we also have characters like U.S. Agent, who is on table, is movie aligned, and is something that we have something to say about. He fits in the plot, so great. We can use U.S. Agent. And I am an old Master of Kung Fu fan. I really wanted to use Shang-Chi because he started as an espionage character, and it really felt like a way to like answer back to that character's origins. And so then you look at the team lineup, and you're like, well, that looks very like a lot of people are like, it's very movie aligned. Oh, the movie is like doing a Thunderbolts thing. It's like, no, we're just using some of the same characters. That's all it is. I don't know what they're doing in the movies. I don't know what they're doing there. We have our own thing. It's our own structure. It's built for comics. It's built to extend the narrative. It's all built on what we've been doing in Captain America and where we want to go with some of these characters. Like, this is not us. No one's taking cues like orders from the movie side. We're just trying to be wise about how we cross readership over, ideally, and then use that to try to tell new stories. So that's my very long and hedgy answer on that point, but I think it's a complicated one. You don't want these comics to become adaptations of the MCU. That's then the tail is eating it's an Ouroboros. That's terrible, right? The comics need to be, I really think of comics as being, we're doing the MCU is going to be out of plot pretty soon. They're going to be out of comics. They burned through the big stuff. We've got Skrull War. We've got Avengers Disassembled, which they've kind of already done.
I would say, yeah, a little bit. They've done that.
We've got House of M, but they've got a lot to build before then, right? They don't even have Venom in the universe, so the idea of doing King of Black or anything like that is just like not going to. What do they have to do? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like, what do they have to do yet, right? My thing is, we got to be writing the stuff for the next 10 years. We have to be carving that path now. We have to be building that track so the railroad can go down it. And I admit we are the track, not the railroad. But that's just by nature of how many people are watching versus how many people are reading. The track is just as important. And for me, it's the art. Like, that's the thing I love. So, as we're getting into comics and as we're looking down that way, we're not sort of trying to say like, what's the Marvel Universe doing now and how do we feed that back in? What we're trying to do is be like, how do I give the Marvel Universe something to make in 10 years that is new and fresh and pushes that forward? And that's my goal.
Man, I love that. I love that so much. And people that, watch and listen to us kind of know us as the MCU Marvel boys. So to get the perspective of someone who, like I said, is actually intimately in this universe, and not only that, but again, like a film nerd, as you say, that is just so awesome to hear that perspective. So I want to get into Kang a little bit, and there's something that I know Gorgon wants to push back a little bit on. And so when you guys I was doing a little research before we got on here, and I saw, so when you guys were talking about Kang, this was I think before the book even came out, but you guys were talking about Kang, and speaking on Kang, you said Kang cannot get out of his own way. That ego and drive to be the best version of himself is exactly what pushes him back to what he never wanted to be. And then you said that the entire universe is written against this man who's trying desperately to push out of it, and he thinks that it's the universe doing it, but it's not. It's him. It was always him. He just wants to be a good person. Now, I know Gorgon has a little bit of pushback on that, so I wanted to see, can you unpack that a little bit? What about Kang, and from a writing perspective, do you feel that he wants to be a good person?
Is that where the pushback is? You're like Nathaniel doesn't want to be a good person.
Thor throws me to the wolves, but it's what is good, right, and what is a person, right? Because there's almost a separation, right, in comics where, like, arguably Kang one of the barriers that separates us as a three-dimensional entity, right, a person, from what is a god, is being bound by linear time, right? I'm a regular fan of saying that in writing is one of the biggest things that holds humans back in comics, and then we see as they grow and they lose that barrier, ascend to godhood. Look at where Eddie Brock currently is as Venom, right? With it all, perfect example. So is Kang even really, as someone who has mastered what is linear time, a person anymore? And I feel like we could really feel that disconnect in the way y'all wrote him, right? With no one left to conquer but myself, and that it was a battle of conquering the self. And I wonder if there needs to come a point where Kang needs to accept that the days of being a person are truly beyond Kang. No matter what Kang tries to do to re-steer that, those days are gone. Kang is a god.
So that's a really interesting point. The idea that by conquering linear time, you stop being a person is a fascinating premise to me, because so Eddie's version of this is a little bit different than Nate's version of this. So I'm going to use them to talk about the distinction, because I think it's actually a really solid distinction. Eddie has ascended to a certain space where it's not simply that he doesn't live linearly anymore, but it's that he has access to all of space and time. And like Kang, which is why I think Kang got involved in that story, he has started to loop back on himself and cause himself chaos and cause himself problems, right? That by becoming God, he's causing himself as a person problems. Kang, while he does have access to all of space and time, Kang is still living more than Eddie is, I think, because Eddie has access to all the symbiotes, and it's a very like omniscient concept. Kang is living still in a straight line. Nathaniel can, like, that straight line, which is Nathaniel's life, is still experienced linearly. He's still experiencing moment, then moment, then moment, then moment, then moment. And
Right.
the rest of time is warping around that. And he's mastered it insofar as he's conquered all of that stuff. But he is still, in my mind, a person, because he is still moving like all of us do, moment to moment to moment to moment to moment. And he cannot properly rewind. Kang, if he rewinds his life, he's not rewinding his own experience. He's just rewinding the rest of time. What's happened has happened to him. And that's why the book is structured the way it is. Because the way that we wanted to essay this is that no matter how much God-level power Nathaniel achieves, he is still living in a straight line. And that straight line, no matter how much he tries to bend it up, is still a straight line. And it just, and it inevitably lands at the beginning of a new line, which is the next Nate, which was just the first Nate, right? And that's the loop. But the loop is a cage that he's built for himself as a god, right? That keeps him as a person. It's this like really, to me, it's the fascinating thing about him is that, yes, you're right. The best way for Kang to get over his shit would be for him to be like, I'm done trying to be a man. I'm done trying to be in love. I'm done trying to be in charge. I'm done trying to strive for power or get in quipping fights with Dr. Doom. I'm done trying to prove anything to anyone, right? And it's time for me to just be the ascended thing. And the ascended thing, ultimately, I would argue, is Immortus. That's what Immortus represents. And if we had, I think I've said this a little bit publicly, but like we had a sequel we wanted to do to Kang, which maybe someday we'll get to do. But the character's kind of overexposed right now, so it didn't make a lot of sense. Given that like he's in Avengers and like Jed's got that character, and I'm doing Timeless and all this stuff, and it's like I the last thing I want to do is step on Jed McKay's toes. So, but we talked a lot about doing a sequel, and that sequel would have to be fundamentally obsessed with this idea. Like the whole of the sequel was obsessed with the idea of what is Immortus to this character, because that's one thing we don't touch in Only Myself Left to Conquer is Immortus, is this idea that at some point at the end of his line, that linear line, he finally does go, oh, that was a bunch of bullshit. I could have just sat back and like gotten zen and like kept the timeline safe. I could have just been a quote unquote good person, and by doing so stop being a person, and maybe good becomes relative, right? And that's an interesting place to play that character, but I don't think Kang gets there. I think when he gets there, he's Immortus. And until then, he's got that like, it's the same thing that like Alexander had, right? Like Alexander was a man. He was a man who conquered half the known world, but like he was a man. The people who we think of in our world as gods, they're all just people. They're just people with an enormous amount of power and ambition and damage that drives them forward. And so I wouldn't really know how to write a book entirely from the perspective of a god. I can write a book from the perspective of a human who's trying to reckon with it, which I think we do a lot. Obviously, like that's what we're doing on Trek. It's what we've done on this. To some degree, it's what we're going to be doing in Batman Beyond this year. It's definitely what we're doing in Outsiders. Like, there's a lot. We're very interested in that line between being a person and being something more. And how that it's very easy for your physical body to ascend in these superhero universes, because you can get like hit by radiation or get struck by lightning or get an alien symbiote or whatever. But that it's actually very hard to ascend your mind, which I argue is relatively true of humans in our world too.
Agreeable.
Wow,
I think this is fascinating. Thank you for this on it. I think there's a line in the Venom run, when Kang comes in and Kang's first basically like they're sword fighting and talking to him about it, where basically he's telling them that like, you are falling through time, I am waltzing through it. So I think you kind of nailed that on the head, right? Like he has a line about it's better to dance between the raindrops of time than get washed away in the current. And Eddie is falling through it, Kang is waltzing.
I love that idea, because I don't think that's true. I think Kang thinks he's waltzing through time.
Oh yeah,
He's stumbling.
I think Kang, like most megalomaniacal people, is making bad decisions and then trying desperately to make sure that they don't become problems. Right? Like he's like one of those guys who's like constantly failing upward because he can, but then he can look back at it and be like, oh yeah, I meant to do that.
Yeah, that was always part of the plan.
So many times. You were a mess.
Man,
Everybody
swear.
likes to think they're the hero of their own story, right?
Exactly.
And that's why I say that Nate wants to be a good person. It's exactly that point. I think he thinks he's the hero of his own story, but he's one of the only people who has that, who you can say that about, who is also the villain of his own story, literally, right? That he's like, that now with Only Myself Left to Conquer added to the canon, right? What you can see is a character who starts with a certain amount of villainous ambition, but isn't a bad guy. And then he meets himself as a bad guy. And that guy is like, you can be the fucking worst. And this kid's like, I don't want to, that's not what I want to be. I want to be me. And it's like, no, man, no matter what you do, you're going to end up being the worst. And the more that you fight that, the more that you fall into it. And like that loop and that build just felt so human and felt so real. Because I think we all have that in somebody in our life. You know, we have the person who we know who made the choices we don't want to make. For Colin and I, that's our fathers, but like there's a lot of that in our worlds. You have those people where you're like, man, I don't want to be that. And our thing with Kang was like, what if you had no choice? What if you were stuck? Like, what kind of life do you lead and how do you live with that? I would love for Kang to someday exhibit any weakness in front of anybody else. But he seems to only exhibit weakness in front of himself and Ravonna, and that's like it.
Well, hopefully you guys get a chance to come back to Kang and you can touch on that. And I mean,
someday.
It's just so interesting to hear you talk about it. I mean, we could sit here all day and just talk about Kang because it is just so interesting to hear you explain that. But we got to hit Cap. We got to talk all about Captain. And I think Kang is a good segue into that because actually it was your guys' first. So Kang was your first Marvel book. And in your very first meeting with Alana Smith, who you mentioned earlier, longtime Marvel editor, she actually said that you guys would be great for Cap. And I feel that through my research and what I've learned about you guys, it seems like Cap was kind of a character always written in the stars for you guys. I mean, Colin has talked about one of his first subscriptions was Captain America comics. You guys talked about bonding over picking up Captain America comics at Golden Apple together. And it, like I said, just seems like this was always fated to happen to you guys. So I want to ask, obviously, I'm going to let Cap take on most of this questioning and answers because he's the expert here. But I mean, like, what was when that opportunity came about? One, what was your first thought? And two, I saw that you said before that when you guys were starting writing this, you actually kind of got nervous because you felt that you weren't a good enough person to write Steve Rogers. And I just thought that was very interesting. I was wondering, like I said, Cap's going to take on the head of this, but can you kind of unpack that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I actually really feel like it's important to talk about because I know other writers go through this and we don't talk about it a lot because I don't know, it's like Kang, you don't exhibit weakness, right? But a big part of colonized process is exhibiting weakness to one another, right? So I'm very open about just like talking about it publicly. When we got the job, we didn't think we were gonna get it. Really, truly did not think we were gonna get it. We'd been told in the first email by Alana, who was, I think, smart to do this, said, like, you're not going to get this job, but you should pitch it and pitch as hard as you can so that everyone at Marvel knows what I know, which is that you guys can do this, right? But, you know, you're new to the company, so you're probably not going to get this gig. But it was like, you know, it was Cap, it's a dream job for us. I don't think anything ever feels written in the stars for us, though this last year has made me question that a little bit because between Cap and
telling you, man,
and some other stuff we've had, you know, Outsiders also is going to be like this, where it's just something that we've been talking about doing since we were teenagers, you know? So it's like the idea of getting to do it is just kind of insane to us. With Cap, we'd had a pitch going forever. We knew what that plot was going to be. We'd had the Outer Circle in our pocket for about a year at least before we ever got asked to pitch it, just because we would talk about Cap. I think that literally started from, like, I had a conversation with Donnie where Donnie was like, it was like his birthday dinner or something, and he was like, you know, I changed.
Johnny Cates.
Johnny Cates,
I was saying, are you just
Um,
name dropping Cates in here? Like,
I
okay,
am,
no
yeah,
big
yeah. Well,
deal.
because when he lived in LA, he and Megan, his ex-wife, were good friends. So I was at like a dinner with him, and I remember he said to me, he was like, you know, I changed what the Venom symbol meant, and we were talking about like what the Venom symbol meant versus like it's not a spider, it's this symbol, and it means for null and all this stuff. And I was like, oh, it's really interesting to like look at the symbols and like try to sort of predicate that out. And I don't know if that got me looking at Steve or if I was already looking at Steve, but like I always remember Donnie, him just being like, oh, I changed what the symbol meant. I was like, that's a very brash thing to do. And so we were looking at Sentinel, and we were like, we were looking at Steve, and we we're like, what do you think the symbol means if it's not just the American flag? And the Outer Circle came from that. We'd had all those conversations. We had that ready to go. When we got into the book, though, the thing that I know through us was we were like, you get this character and you start to write him, and you're like, man, if you try to be honest in your writing and you try to write from you and write from your heart, and it's much easier for me to write about Nathaniel Richards, a person with too much ambition and a lot of trauma and a lot of problems, which are all things that I've had in my life. Much easier to write about that guy than to write about Steve, a character who is his best self at 99% of the time, and who is the person who taught me about morality, right? Like Steve Rogers is hugely important to me, like Superman is, in terms of teaching me how to be a good person in my life, especially how to be a good man. So you get Steve and you're like, now I have to be responsible for doing that for the next generation of kids, for the next man like me who reads this book, that's person like me who reads this book and gets inspired by this. That's coming now from the brains of Colin. And that's a huge responsibility. And it's one that, because it was our first ongoing at Marvel, this doesn't happen to me quite as much, but that one, it definitely did, where I was under a lot of stress in my life. I was in the process of becoming a full-time writer and sort of letting go of my day job and like taking that chance and doing all that. And all at the same time as we were picking up Steve. And so, yeah, I started, for the first time in my life, I started getting panic attacks. And I was trying to figure out why, and eventually sorted out that it was Steve. It was that I was feeling really under the pressure to not let this character who meant so much to me down. And eventually I sort of had to become square with like, you don't need to be Steve to write Steve. But what you do want to be is allow him to inspire you as you're writing. So like what it became for me was a process. I know Colin feels the same way. It became a process of like, you're writing the character and then he says something and you go, oh man, I wish I could think like that. And you're like, well, you did just think like that. You thought like that to write it for Steve, right? Yeah. But he feels like an exterior part of my brain. You know, he feels like he lives over here and has his own world and thoughts and stuff. And then I get sort of like, it's like Grant Morrison, like cosmic connection thing. Like I get the like platonic ideal of Steve Rogers who like tells me stuff and then I'm able to write it down. It doesn't feel like it's coming from me. It feels like it's coming from somewhere else. And that's special for Steve. That's not true of most characters, but it is true of Steve Rogers for some reason. And it just really, it got in my head when I first started. And then I really had to just get clear of that. And I think a lot of that was solved by putting out issue 1. Once issue 1 was out and Cap fans were reacting to it and people were liking it, because I do follow conversation. I do know what people say about our shit, because I want to, I try not to be reactive to it, but I do want to know. And that book, I think once I knew that there were people who liked it, I was able to be like, okay, we didn't fuck it up. And like, once I was able to be like, oh, we didn't fuck it up, then I was able, then we could just write with confidence. But that first issue was like, we got to nail it, man. I felt pressure to do that.
Well, I think you did nail it. And I mean, you definitely got 3 fans of it from that first issue. But again, Cap, he's going to be our expert here. And I know that he really which we all do, really love how you wrote Steve. And like you were just saying that was such a big kind of hurdle for you. But man, you guys nailed it. You fucking nailed it, dude. Cap, take it away.
Yeah, like on the topic of you stressing about obviously being very overwhelmed about writing Steve and stuff, was there any previous run that inspired you on how to write him?
Absolutely, yeah. So my favorite so it's hard because I think Steve is a character who he's been a little bit rocky in terms of characterization over the years, and I think he tends to sit inside of like the politics of the day. I think like especially like post 9/11 Steve is like really tough for me. I went back and revisited a lot of those books, and the sort of like raw nationalism that comes out of him when the country is feeling nationalist, it feels pretty ugly to me. I don't really like that. I have a hard time accessing that. The Steve that I really respond to, by and large, is the one who lives inside of a community and operates as both a paragon and as a friend. So I am a big fan of his characterization. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Brubaker run. The Brubaker run was the one that Colin and I brought around on, because I think it showed a vulnerability between him and Bucky that I really liked, and I wanted to expand upon, but also a vulnerability with him and Sharon. And it showed him as like a leader of the Avengers during a period of time where the Avengers were in crisis. And I thought that all was really, really helpful. But no, I'm a big proponent of his time with Bernie. I think some of the John Byrne stuff is like extremely powerful for the character and has kind of kept him around in a way that feels really strong. But I love the Englehart run, and I love the Englehart characterization, and I think what it does for the character in terms of being a member of community and who that is and how they operate, to me, I just think is really, really core to the character and is fundamental for me. So I think it's that. And then on the flip side, I've talked about this publicly, so this is not I mean this in zero disrespect. But what I wanted was to have the exact opposite experience of the Rick Remender run. I love the Rick Remender run. I think Dimension Z is badass. I used it, obviously, like Colin, I found a way to use it. Initially, we weren't going to, and then we found our way into it. Because it is a really, really great crucible to put Steve through. It's like I said earlier, he is 99% of the time, he's the best version of himself. Dimension Z is the 1%. Mm-hmm. It's the one place where Steve makes bad decisions and loses himself and gets disconnected from Steve Rogers and kind of becomes Captain America in this like very different way. But generally, I really, really, while I love that run, I really wanted you to have the exact opposite emotional feeling from that, because the Remender run is very dark and very sad and very angry and very gritty and very depressing and very cynical. And that's what Rick does. It's why he's great. Why Pretty Deadly worked, right? Like because they're not Pretty Deadly, geez, Deadly Class. That's why Deadly Class works, because it so embraces that part of himself. Steve's a really hard character to operate in that mode. So with me, I went back to Steve Englehart a lot. I went back to Brubaker a lot. I went back to John Byrne a bit, and really tried to. And then honestly, and you're the MCU guys, so maybe this is comfortable territory. I think his characterization in the MCU is absolutely brilliant. I really think it is. I think what Chris Evans did with that character over his course of time as Steve Rogers is fundamentally accurate in a way that like very few characters are like that, where you're like, oh, that's an interpretation. I like the opposite version of that is Star-Lord, right? Mm-hmm. Star-Lord is as fundamentally as different a character in those movies as he could be in the comics. And then when you write comic Star-Lord, a lot of times people come back to you and are like, this doesn't feel like the character. And it's like, yeah, because you are imagining the movie guy, and that's not who the guy is. But for me, movie Cap and comics Cap are the same Cap. They did it. They pretty much nailed it. And so I oftentimes would read the dialogue and be like, can I imagine Chris Evans saying this? If I can imagine Chris Evans saying this, if I can imagine this beat being done in live action with Chris, then I would feel like we're doing something that works. So that's sort of my like, those are the two sides of it. Is like there's some old runs, especially the ones that involved him as a civilian, the ones that involved him as an artist, gave him a day job, had a secret identity, all that stuff. That all felt really germane to what we were doing. And then Chris Evans is just very inspiring.
I really like how you took him back to his home, like where he grew up. But so we were reading earlier, and you said your first, what was it? One of your first interactions with Steve was through the Ultimates. Was it hard to like balance Steve from 1610 to 616? Was it hard to like figure out where to.
Say, we all know Cap
Yeah.
has very strong feelings about Earth 1610.
Yeah.
Cap.
Yeah. 1610 Cap is a different person, and he is fundamentally different. So for me, it's like I don't ever get those characters confused. Something that 1610 Steve would do is something that 616 Steve just simply wouldn't. Like, they're just so different. He was one of my first interactions with the character. That's true. But because Ultimates was one of the first Marvel books I ever picked up. I mean, certainly it was before I ever picked up an Avengers book or anything like that. I picked up Ultimates. But I have learned over the course of my life that the stuff that I really liked about Ultimates is stuff that I really liked when I was like a teenager. You know, like,
Yeah.
book really speaks to the like post 9/11 cynical teenager in me. And the further I've gotten from that, when I revisit Ultimates, which I do on occasion, the less it's felt like it has something, you know, like a tie from my heart to it anymore. I find less and less and less of that accessing, which isn't true of all the Ultimates books. Ultimate Spider-Man, I think, still is able to grab me pretty solidly, but like Ultimates, I have a harder time with these days. And a big part of it is Steve. Is that Steve and Tony are both written so cynically. And I think it's easy to write, or not easy to write. It's Tony makes a lot of sense as a cynical character, and Steve at the time, as I said, it gets really ugly during those like nationalist periods. So so I think that's actually really cool what they did with him there. But he's not the same character in any respect. I never went back to Ultimates when we were getting into this book at all.
Yeah, we were talking about that, and like I said, we all know Cap has very strong opinions on 1610, and when we were looking at that, we're like, man, I think that must mean like his first Cap story was probably an Ultimate story. We're like, that's fucking insane. Like, and now he's writing the best